I'm just going to introduce our next speaker for this evening. So I'd like to introduce Madeline Crawford. Madeline is a third-year medical student at Dalhousie Medical School, and she's interested in medical research and dermatology and uses her passion to improve access for patients to have their lesions of concerns examined for skin cancer. So Madeline was the lead author on a project that implemented a melanoma screening program through a form of artificial intelligence in which they detected 11 melanomas in 2 months. Madeline has also contributed to medical education through ongoing dermatology research, and she's published articles geared towards assisting general practitioners to recognize common skin conditions in their practice, and particularly in skin of color. So thank you so much for joining us, Madeline.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Abby. My name is Madeline Crawford, and as she mentioned, I'm currently in my third year of medical school at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And tonight, I'm going to be sharing with you guys the project I completed that started in the summer of 2022 and really just finished wrapping up this past December. And it was on using artificial intelligence as a melanoma screening tool in self-referred patients. I don't have any relevant conflicts of interest to disclose, but I did want to mention the funding that in part made this research possible, and they were mostly medical research grants for medical students. So essentially, I'm just going to start off first with a bit of background about why we chose to do a study on AI as a potential screening program for melanoma. Right now, Nova Scotia currently has one of the highest incidents of melanoma in Canada. And how our current healthcare system model works is when a patient is concerned about a skin lesion being cancerous, they first have to see a primary care provider and then get a subsequent referral to see a dermatologist. However, there is a significant lack of access to healthcare right now. In Nova Scotia, specifically with primary health care, with over 31% of the population who does not have access to primary health care practitioners. And even those who do have access, many primary care physicians may not have the additional training in being able to detect those clinically difficult skin cancers, such as early stage melanoma. And what that ends up leading to is subsequent delays in diagnosis and subsequent referrals to see a specialist in order to have a lesion of concern examined. And all of this can ultimately delay the diagnosis of melanoma. And while melanoma is one of the more fatal skin cancers causing death, it is curable and it has an excellent prognosis when it's detected in its early stages. And therefore, the goal of this study was to examine the feasibility or the ability of an artificial intelligence system or AI system to identify melanoma in self-referred patients and compare that to experienced dermatologists to see if we could use artificial intelligence as a screening program to potentially improve the detection of melanoma in its early stages. And the target population of the study was any individual who had a mole of concern that they wanted examined. So a bit of background on the artificial intelligence system that we used. So essentially how this system worked is it had a camera device attached to it that essentially took those dermatoscopic images that Dr. Nadiri had mentioned a few moments ago. So those in-depth images of moles. And essentially it would automatically upload that image to a computer software database. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see what those images looked like and how that AI system would analyze the images. And essentially, this computer software uses a deep learning algorithm that was used to more accurately identify features common to skin cancer. So it was validated using an image bank of thousands of known skin cancers, and it was programmed to detect features of melanoma, basal cell carcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, and those precancerous lesions called actinic keratoses. And the system that we used in this case was the Photo Finder Mole Analyzer Pro. And while we don't have any affiliations with this company, I did want to mention that because I believe that's the same program that's being talked about in the next presentation. So this was what we kind of used to determine whether or not the AI could accurately identify skin cancers. So essentially how kind of study worked is we first had advertisement posters of our study in local hospitals, family practice clinics, as well as local pharmacies. And there were only two criteria for enrollment. So the patient had to be over the age of 18 years, and they had to have a mole or skin lesion that they were concerned about. And as long as they met those two criteria, they were able to enroll in the study. So they could contact us directly from the advertisement posters via email or phone, and we would see the patient within a week of their initial contact with us. And the patient screening ran from June 1st to August 12th of 2022. And in just a little bit over 2 months, we ended up recruiting 482 participants, which is a large number for the short amount of time that we had the study active for. So essentially how the appointments would work is the patient would come in to have their lesion of concern examined by one of 4 medical school students who had extensive training prior in the melanoma clinic in Dalhousie University, just to get more familiar with common skin conditions as well as malignant skin lesions. So I was one of the 4 medical school students who ran the patient screening and organized patients coming in for appointments. So essentially they would come in, and if their skin lesion or lesions of concern met the inclusion exclusion criteria for the study, we would then take images of the mole using that AI device. We would then upload the dermatoscopic images to the computer software that would automatically analyze the image and generate a score. And essentially the score that the AI came up with would indicate whether or not it felt that the mole was cancerous and needed to be removed. And at the end of each screening day, we sent all of those dermatoscopic images from the AI device to 3 community dermatologists, as well as a senior dermatology resident. And all they were provided with were the images of the lesion of concern, as well as a brief history on the patient that just stratified their risk of skin cancer to help the dermatologist make their diagnosis when reviewing the images. And all of the dermatologists were blinded to the results of the AI. So they were not given any information as to whether or not the AI thought the lesion was cancerous. So either if the AI or the dermatologist suggested an excision, the lesion was removed, and we would schedule the patient to have their lesion removed within 2 weeks of their initial appointment. Subsequently, we also had a dermatologist who was a world expert in dermoscopy, so a world expert of specifically analyzing those dermatoscopic images. And she evaluated all excised lesions in the study as well, and was blinded to both the results from the other dermatologists as well as the artificial intelligence. So just briefly, I wanted to touch on the exclusion criteria that we had for our study. So we divided it in 2 separate categories. There was the technical exclusions and the clinical assessment exclusions. So technical exclusions were really limitations that this form of artificial intelligence had at the time that we completed this study. And this mainly included lesions that were inaccessible to the AI camera, as well as lesions that were close to tattoos or other skin disorders. And unfortunately, in this study, we did have to exclude lesions in those individuals who do have darker skin tones. And this is just for the fact that at the time when we completed the study, the AI had not yet been trained or validated in people with those darker skin tones. And then we also had the clinical assessment exclusions. So all of the medical school students who took part in this screening were also trained to exclude common benign skin lesions. And therefore, if a patient presented with one of the following skin conditions, they would be excluded from the study. That being said, any lesion in which we weren't sure about the diagnosis or whether or not it was a benign skin condition, or if it was a pigmented lesion or mole, we would always include those in the study if there was any uncertainty at all. And I briefly wanted to touch on the patient demographics, so the patient population that we ended up receiving from our study. So out of the 482 participants that enrolled, we ended up having 318 participants who met the inclusion-exclusion criteria. And of those participants, 72.9% were female, which is a large difference between the males and females that were involved in the study. I also wanted to highlight that almost 29% of patients had a family history of melanoma, and 4.4% had a personal history of melanoma. And this just highlights that patients are concerned about their risk of skin cancer, specifically those who had a personal history or family history of melanoma. And I'm going to get into the results that we found from the lesions that were removed in a second here. But I did want to note that we ended up having 10 melanomas that were detected in our study. And of those 10 melanomas, 5 of those were in patients who had a family history of skin cancer, which confirms what we already know about skin cancer, is that those with a family history of melanoma are at a higher risk themselves of developing melanoma in the future. So out of the 381 lesions that were included, as some participants had more than one mole that they wanted us to look at, we ended up having 81 lesions that were removed or flagged for excision by either the AI or the dermatologist. And of those 83 lesions that were removed, we ended up detecting 17 skin cancers, 10 of which were melanomas. 6 were pigmented basal cell carcinomas, and 1 was a pigmented squamous cell carcinoma in situ. And it's not mentioned on here, but we did end up excluding a lesion due to a technical limitation. However, we still would send these exclusions to dermatologists as well, just to have just so they could still review the images. And we did end up detecting another melanoma that met an exclusion criteria. So we didn't include it in the overall study results, but there was 11 melanomas from this study that we ended up catching. And of the 83 excised lesions, the AI had flagged 27 of these for removal, and it ended up identifying 11 of the skin cancers. And all dermatologists in the study identified between 8 to 14 of the skin cancers, so no one in the study ended up detecting all 17 malignancies. And now I'm just going to briefly touch on the statistical evaluation of the excised lesions. I'm not going to get too bogged down with the details, as stats can be very confusing for everyone. So I'm going to try and keep this as simple as possible. And I'll just look at the diagnostic accuracy for now when I'm speaking to you on the results. So essentially, the diagnostic accuracy is the overall probability that the skin lesion was correctly classified as a skin cancer. So essentially, the overall ability to accurately detect and diagnose skin cancer. And what we found is that the artificial intelligence had the second highest diagnostic accuracy to that of all dermatologists in the study. So the AI had a diagnostic accuracy of 73.5%. And the only dermatologist who had a higher diagnostic accuracy was the world expert in dermoscopy at 74.7%. And therefore, it was found that the AI did have a comparable diagnostic accuracy to all other dermatologists in the study. And we subsequently used another statistical parameter in order to assess the diagnostic accuracy as well. This is something called an ROC curve. Again, I'm not going to get into the details about it, but essentially it measures the diagnostic accuracy of an observer in order to detect skin cancer, for instance. So essentially, it looks at the area under the curve. So the area under these lines on the graph shown on the right-hand side. And essentially, if the area under this graph or the score is above 0.7, that means that the observer has an acceptable diagnostic accuracy. So we use this to, again, look at the diagnostic accuracy in the AI and the dermatologist to correctly diagnose melanoma. And what we found is that the AI had the second highest diagnostic accuracy, again, with this parameter of 0.7. And the only one to have a higher diagnostic accuracy was the expert dermatologist in dermoscopy at a score of 0.7. And only the expert in dermoscopy and the artificial intelligence were the only observers to score 0.7 or above. Before I go into conclusion, I did want to briefly touch on some limitations of our study. The first limitation is that the AI system was unable to scan all lesions of concern for technical reasons, as I mentioned previously. And the other limitation we had is that not all lesions included in the study were excised for practical purposes. So if both the AI and the dermatologist classified the lesion of benign, those lesions were not excised, and their final diagnosis was that it was a benign skin lesion. And finally, just moving into conclusions as I wrap up my presentation today. So our study recruited 482 participants, which highlighted that members of the public are concerned about their skin and their possibility of skin cancer. Unfortunately, many patients do not have access to expert care, and we have shown the need for easier access to expert advice for patients who are concerned about their skin. And this study demonstrated that AI screening can be practical, and its accuracy in detecting skin cancer was non-inferior comparable to that of experienced dermatologists. And therefore, what we suggested from the results of our study is that the AI has the potential and should be incorporated into cancer screening programs that could essentially allow patients needing an urgent assessment of the lesion they're concerned about to have that lesion of concern examined in a timely manner. And essentially, having a screening program like this would allow patients without access to primary care to have their mole urgently examined. And by detecting melanoma in its early stages, you're not only saving on many future healthcare costs, but you're also saving the life of that individual, and you're significantly leading to a greater prognosis and improving their quality of life when you're detecting melanoma in its early stages. And that's why a screening program like this would be so important to be incorporated into our cancer care centers, especially in areas that have lack of access to both primary and specialist healthcare, such as many regions in Nova Scotia. So that concludes my presentation today, and I did just want to end briefly on the acknowledgements to acknowledge all of the individuals who made this project possible. This is our study that was recently published in the January and February issue of the Journal of Cutaneous Medicine and Surgery. I just wanted to thank the other medical students who were involved in this study, as well as all of the dermatologists who put their hard work in. And most importantly, I also wanted to thank and acknowledge all 482 patients that enrolled in this study, because the study really wouldn't have been possible without them. And it provided us with some very valuable results on how AI could help be used as a screening program in the future for skin cancer. So that concludes my presentation, and thank you everyone for listening.